Battle of Stalingrad was one of the deadliest battles in human history, leaving over 2 million passed away. The city became a nightmarish wasteland, reduced to rubble by constant bombings. Civilians were trapped in brutal conditions, facing starvation, freezing temperatures, and relentless violence. Entire families were wiped out as street fighting turned homes and basements into death traps. Soviet and Nazi soldiers fought to the last breath, with corpses piling up in the ruins. The stench of death filled the air, making Stalingrad a morbid symbol of war's terrifying brutality. In June 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a brutal invasion of the Soviet Union. Within months, millions of Soviet soldiers were offed or captured. Entire armies were surrounded and annihilated. The horrors didn't end there. POWs faced starvation, torture, and execution. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, with entire villages burned to the ground. The scale of death and destruction was unimaginable. The Soviet Union teetered on the brink of collapse, but the worst was still to come, as the invasion marked the beginning of a war, fought with terrifying brutality on both sides. In the 1940s, Stalin unleashed a terrifying campaign of mass deportations, forcibly relocating entire ethnic groups like the Chechens, Crimean Tatars, and Volga Germans. Crammed into overcrowded trains, they were sent to the freezing wastelands of Siberia and Central Asia. Thousands died on the journey from starvation, disease, and extreme conditions. Families were ripped apart, never to be reunited. Those who survived faced brutal conditions, with little food, shelter, or medical care. The death toll soared, making this one of the most morbid and devastating chapters of Soviet repression. In 1940, deep in the Katyn forest, one of history's most chilling mass executions took place. The Soviet secret police, the NKVD, systematically executed nearly 22,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, and POWs. Victims were shot in the back of the head, one by one, and buried in hidden mass graves. The massacre was so brutal that it remained covered up for decades, with both Nazi and Soviet regimes attempting to shift blame. It wasn't until the 1990s that the truth finally came to light, revealing a dark chapter of human cruelty. The Siege of Leningrad was one of the longest and most horrific sieges in history, lasting 872 days during World War II. The city, cut off by Nazi forces, was subjected to relentless artillery bombardment and starvation. Over 1 million people perished from hunger, disease, and the freezing cold. In a horrific turn of desperation, some resorted to cannibalism to survive. Entire families passed away in their homes, and people who had passed away littered the streets. Despite the terror and deprivation, Leningrad never surrendered, but the siege left an indelible scar on the city and its survivors. In 1972, a plane carrying a Uruguayan rugby team crashed deep in the Andes Mountains. The survivors faced freezing temperatures, no food, and little hope of rescue. As days turned into weeks, starvation became unbearable. In a morbid turn, they made a desperate decision. To survive, they had to eat the bodies of those who had died. For 72 harrowing days, they clung to life, enduring unimaginable horrors before being rescued. The story remains one of the scariest and most disturbing tales of survival in history, revealing the terrifying lengths humans will go to when faced with death. In 2000, the Kursk, a Russian nuclear submarine, suffered a catastrophic explosion during a training exercise, trapping 118 sailors deep under the Barents Sea. The blast left the sub partially flooded, and the crew faced days of unimaginable horror, struggling in freezing temperatures and diminishing oxygen. Rescue efforts were too slow and ineffective. Tragically, all aboard perished, with evidence showing some sailors survived the initial explosion, only to die later as the submarine slowly filled with water. The morbid realization of their fate haunts the disaster, making it one of the scariest naval tragedies in history. Marcellus Williams was convicted of the brutal 1998 murder of Felicia Gail, a former journalist. During a home invasion, Williams stabbed Gail 43 times. He was sentenced to death, but his case gained national attention due to debates over DNA evidence and claims of racial bias. Williams maintained his innocence, and some argued that DNA found on the murder weapon didn't match him. However, courts repeatedly upheld his conviction, citing other evidence such as his possession of Gail's belongings and his confession to the crime. Despite calls from prosecutors and the victim's family to spare his life, Marcellus Williams was executed by the state of Missouri on September 25, 2024 at the state prison in Bonne Terre. Felicia Gail, a former journalist and social worker, was brutally murdered in her Missouri home in 1998. She was stabbed 43 times by Marcellus Williams during a home invasion. Williams was convicted and sentenced to death, but controversy arose regarding the validity of DNA evidence and claims of racial bias. Despite numerous appeals, his guilt was reaffirmed by multiple courts. Felicia's death was overshadowed by the focus on Williams' case, with many overlooking the horrifying details of her murder and the pain her family endured. In 2002, the Moscow theater became the site of a terrifying hostage crisis. Over 850 people were held captive by Chechen militants, trapped in fear for days. As the standoff continued, Russian forces made a desperate decision. They pumped an unknown gas into the theater before storming it. The result was horrible and tragic. Though many hostages were rescued, over 120 died, not from bullets or bombs, but from the very gas meant to save them. Survivors emerged scarred, haunted by the horror of watching others perish around them in a deadly rescue attempt gone wrong. In 1846, the Donner Party, a group of pioneers, found themselves trapped by snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains. With no food and freezing conditions, their situation turned desperate. Starvation set in, and the survivors were forced into a horrifying decision: cannibalism. As their companions died from hunger and exposure, they resorted to eating the bodies of the deceased to survive. The morbid reality of their nightmare haunted them until a rescue party finally arrived. But by then, nearly half had perished, and those who survived were forever scarred by the horrors they endured. Imagine being trapped 2,300 feet underground for 69 days in total darkness. No sunlight, no way out, and the constant fear of death. This was the terrifying reality for 33 Chilean miners in 2010. Rescue teams feared they'd find only bodies. The miners faced starvation, drank contaminated water, and waited in the pitch-black abyss. Their survival was a miracle, but they emerged malnourished and psychologically scarred. The morbid thought of dying underground haunted them every second. It was a rescue mission the world feared might be too late, but thankfully, it wasn't. A man convicted in the offing and robbery of Philadelphia rapper Pnb Rock at a famous Los Angeles eatery was sentenced to 31 years to life in prison. A jury convicted Freddie Lee Trone, age 42, of 1 count of offing, 2 counts of robbery, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit robbery. Prosecutors said Trone ordered his son, then age 17, to rob the rapper, who was dining with his 4-year-old daughter's mother at Roscoe's Chicken and Waffles, a branch of an eatery popular with celebrities, in South Los Angeles on September 12, 2022.